This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is a podcast where since 2017 I have discussed all things religion with a variety of fantastic scholars, historians, journalists, and educators. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Nancy Khalil. Dr. Nancy Khalil is currently an assistant professor of American culture at the University of Michigan, appointed in the Arab and Muslim American Studies program. Her forthcoming manuscript focuses on U.S. Muslim seminaries and the profession of U.S. imams. Khalil has served on a number of nonprofit organization boards, including as a co-founder and board member of the Boston-based Muslim Justice League, and currently she serves on the board for Pillars Fund. Prior to her academic career, she worked in higher education and student development, including as Muslim Chaplain at Wellesley College. On this episode, we discuss her work on the professionalization of being an imam and the importance of public scholarship. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Nancy Khalil. Dr. Nancy Khalil, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I'm delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can start off by having you introduce yourself to the listeners out there a little bit so they know who you are and what you do.
Sure. I am currently an assistant professor of American culture at the University of Michigan, appointed in the Arab and Muslim American Studies program, which is part of our ethnic studies units on campus. And I am an anthropologist by training.
Excellent. I'm very interested in your anthropology interests. I noticed that you did your PhD at Harvard in anthropology, and I was curious about that. I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your academic journey, kind of how you got interested in the areas that you became interested in. Tell me a little bit about some of those educational stepping stones along the way that led you to the path that you followed in education.
Sure. I kind of fell into anthropology. I did an undergraduate degree in advertising and another one in economics. And then 9/11 happened while I was in college. And that really took my presence and activism on campus down a different path, getting engaged with different projects with the Muslim community, interfaith events, being more present in public spaces, and had me reconsidering what it is I wanted to do with the rest of my time. I decided that it would be nice to stay on a college campus. So I looked into different programs in higher education administration and pursued a master's in those, and worked in parallel as a Muslim chaplain at Wellesley College for 4 years. And that in part inspires a lot of my research today, which we'll talk about, I'm sure. So once I finished that program, and then I decided it would be good to do a terminal degree, or to have a degree that doesn't give me ceilings when I'm in my career, when I'm looking for future jobs. And I started to explore what degrees could I get. I was working as a research assistant at a project, through the Islam in the West program in the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. And they were doing field work with the Muslim community in Boston as a part of a transatlantic research project on Muslims that was meant to be a large survey. And all of the researchers that they hired to help were mostly people that had connections with the Muslim community, but didn't have a lot of research experience. So they conducted a crash course in fieldwork and focus groups for all of us over the semester as we were entering and networking with the community. And through that, that's where I learned about anthropology. I was exposed to some ethnographies on the American Muslim community as a part of that research project, and met some of the faculty and thought, okay, this might be a discipline that would support my interests in Muslims in the US and also teach me new things. And I am intrigued by this methodological ethnographic approach they use. And that's what led me to the anthropology degree.
So you go into Harvard in the anthropology PhD program. Tell me a little bit about finding what becomes your area of focus along the way. Tell me about like that honing in on what it is that you wanted to specifically study when you got into that PhD program.
Sure, that's a journey for so many academics. There are some that come in with a very particular project and stick to it for their entire experience. And then there are others who take complete left turns. I had one cohort member who started off studying Catholicism in India and ended up studying single family housing in Detroit,
Mm.
and graduating with a dissertation on that topic. So it's very, very different, very different spaces. But for me, I knew generally that I wanted to do research on Muslims in the United States, and I had an interest in higher education, and that those were the broad categories. And what I ended up doing was some preliminary field work. You visit different communities, you spend time with them. I spent time at a terrorism trial in Boston, which is what led me to really question how do we determine who's an imam and who isn't,
Mm.
because the different imams were invoked in the trial in different ways. And then the marathon trial after the marathon bombing that happened, also same thing, same question arose again. And that was while I was deeper in the research. And part of that is also, well, what does it mean to train imams and who's doing that and why do they want to do it and what are they trying to achieve with it? And that's what tied in my higher education interest, spending time at Muslim seminaries that were emerging and understanding what their goals were, what their objectives were, who they wanted to teach and what they wanted to teach them. So that kind of brought together a lot of my interests. And then it just coalesced around this figure of the imam, who a lot of people are really committed and interested in. Like people have a lot of thoughts and comments and ideas and opinions on an imam and who can be an imam and who can't be an imam and what should an imam do and when is an imam good and when is an imam weak and all these sorts of things. So that's how it came together.
I love that. So I do want to talk about one of your projects. I was delighted to, I've never talked about this topic on the podcast before. I've never talked about who is an imam and who isn't. What is the professionalization of being an imam? Like these are all questions that I've never considered before until reading your articles. So this was a real delight for me. Um, I read one that you sent me called "He's Not an Imam." He LOL. He's a postal worker, and you have to say the LOL because it just jumps out at me whenever I'm reading the title. He's not an imam. LOL. He's a postal worker from the politics of Islam in Europe and North America. So I want to start basically on this question and on this article. So tell me a little bit about where Islamic authority comes from for imams. And I'm just curious if you can just kind of unpack that for me, and then we'll compare it to some other religions as well a little bit. But tell me, where does that authority come from?
Okay, so first we got to do a little bit of background. What's an imam or who's an imam? The word imam in Arabic language means leader. Or it's one of many words that mean leader. And the context, if you look in Arabic dictionaries, the word imam describes four different types of leaders, like historically leaders of particular schools of thought within the Sunni Muslim community, which is one of two larger umbrella communities in the within Islamic tradition and Islamic legal theory, that fall under one of those two categories, Sunni or Shia. So the leaders of the schools of thought, the jurisprudential or the kind of law that determines how you apply your faith, the leaders of those schools of thoughts are called imam. In the Shia community, their religious leaders descend from the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and it's believed that they descend from there. And they also call their religious leaders imams, and they have particular identified set of imams that begin from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, going down until today. The other imam is the imam who's the leader of the prayer. Any group praying in congregation, whoever leads them is called an imam. And it's that definition that's kind of been adopted to refer to who might lead a mosque, right? Which is
Hmm.
the house of worship for Muslims. If you go to other Muslim societies, the way they use imam might be different. When they say imam, they might only be referring to the person leading their prayers. When you look at it in the United States, when people say imam, they're referring to the religious leader of their community. That person may not even be the one leading all their prayers, because there are 5 prayers a day in the Muslim community. And if they're leading all the prayers, that's very time intensive.
Mm-hmm.
So with all the other expectations and asks of them, they would not have much time to sleep or to do much other things with their life. So it's often the case that an imam of a mosque in the United States does not actually lead all of the prayers. They might lead 1 or 2 a day, and then the rest are led by other community members, because the imam does other things like performs marriages, might meet with community members who have questions on situations. If there's a death in the community, they'll go and oversee and perform the prayer for that and attend the funeral. They might also be involved in different organized groups of religious leaders in their city that they partake in, other councils that involve other imams dealing with issues that affect the city at large. They might be meeting with different elected officials or political representatives that want to work with the Muslim community, and then all the programming that takes place in the mosques that serves the various demographics. They'll probably be involved in all of that, in addition to preparing a weekly sermon, developing their own knowledge, likely leading a class or 2 for the community. I mean, there's just a lot that an imam can be doing as a full-time worker in a mosque in the United States. And so when you talk about Islamic authority, that's a very big topic. And when we think about authority, typically authority is broadly and like social theories thought of in these 3 categories. Max Weber kind of popularized these. And so there's one called charismatic, which is, the people love you, you have a lot of energy, and they follow you because of that. We see a lot of that, especially on social media these days, but charismatic authority has been there since the dawn of time. It's not social media that invented it. And then you see another that they call traditional authority, which is kind of like what I described earlier with the Shia Muslim community, where it's passed down, or if you think of a monarchy, a king and then a prince, and those are all considered traditional authority. And then there's what he calls a legal bureaucratic authority, which is something that's regulated or authorized by some sort of system that's in place, and they determine through whatever the process that system has that this person is now the leader. So there's all these kind of different ways to understand authority. When you think of it Islamically, it's been kind of a mix of all of that, depending on the community and the group. So when we think of the Muslims in the United States, there is no legal authority. Like the US by design separates religion and state. There's no office of religious affairs that's part of our government like some other countries have. So there's no one determining who can and can't be an imam from the state's perspective in the United States. And then when you think about the Muslim community, especially within the Sunni community, which is about worldwide and in the United States, the numbers are similar, about 85-ish%, give or take a couple, of Muslims tend to fall under Sunnis. So it's a large number of people. In the US, the numbers now are about 4 million-ish Muslims in the United States, about 1% of the population, a little bit more are Muslims. So you can kind of estimate that this is an issue that impacts a good amount of Muslims in the United States, a few million. Among them, there's no central group that polices or regulates or defines the boundaries of, yes, this person is qualified to be an imam, and no, this person is not. It's the community that decides for itself. Every single mosque can decide for themselves who they want to hire to be their imam.
So is it like a job? Is it like a job that is like paid, that makes a salary and things like that? I'm just curious about what that looks like.
That's a great question. It can be.
Yeah.
The most recent data shows that just over half of the people who work as imams in the United States are full-time. So a good number of them are part-time or volunteers. And when they're full-time, it's usually a mosque that's incorporated as a nonprofit religious organization that employs them and gives them a salary. So that would be similar to any job that you're kind of familiar with. and they're employed by the board of that mosque. So they report to that board, which can be a good and a challenging thing, right? Depending on the relationship we have with the board. If you share
For
a vision
sure.
with them, the board changes on you, that could introduce other issues, right? Like there's a lot of politics and layers to it that I talk about in my work. So yeah, it could be a full-time job, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more about this article because now that we know that it can be a job, but it doesn't have to be, some are volunteers, some are part time, some are full time. There's no central authority in this country specifically on who can and cannot be an imam. So we have a nice little foundation here. So in 2016, you write about an article or an advertisement that comes out from Amazon. Tell me a little bit about what appears in this advertisement around in 2016 from Amazon and what the context of that time period was.
2016, there was a presidential election,
A big one.
a big one, and a lot of energy in media and a lot of talk about a Muslim ban, and many communities were surfacing that wanted to show allyship with the Muslim community, and this started to bleed into marketing as well, where different companies would more inclusively present people that presented as if they were Muslim in their ads to show, again, support for a community that was being marginalized by, in particular, the Trump campaign that was really targeting the Muslim community at that time. So this was something that was happening across many different companies, Amazon included. And in this ad, it was a creative ad, to be honest. It has, I believe, a Catholic priest and an imam in there, and you know that just by how they're presented, right? Like the Catholic priest, he has his collar on, he's sitting in his church office. The imam is wearing what most will call a thawb, which is this long, it's not a dress, but it goes down to near your ankles, or if you have pants underneath, it could be a little bit shorter depending on which part of the world you're from. And it'll typically have like a flat collar, usually be a beige or a white color, depending on preference. And then he's wearing what's called a kufi, which is kind of a skull cap of sorts that you'll see some Muslims wear. And he has a beard, and he's got, brown skin. So he's very like prototypical, stereotypical imagination of what an imam can or should or might look like. And
Mm-hmm.
so you see these two figures, and they're clearly friends in the ad, and they each have knee pain, and both of their worship requires using your knees. So if you're Muslim and you're praying your 5 daily prayers, they include, going into prostration, which is when you put your forehead and your nose and your hands on the ground, and your knees as well, right? And your feet. So you're prostrated low. And then it includes standing as well. And you go back and forth between these positions and others. And then for the Catholic priest, he gets on his knees at the pew in his church to say his prayers. And each of them aches when they're getting on their knees. And so in the ad, they each buy each other some sort of brace of sorts to help them with their knee pain. And it's about how fast it was delivered, and right, and how they were able to give each other what they needed, and also the kind of brotherly relationship between them. And when I watched interviews about the ad that included the man who, was the imam in the ad and the man who were the priest, it turns out they actually worked in these positions in real life and knew each other in real life. And when Amazon tried to hire actors, the chemistry just wasn't there. And they said that the reason this ad came out so well was because organically these two had a strong relationship, and that just, became naturally clear in the ad.
What kind of dialogue and commentary did this ad start online? Because I know that there was a little bit of like feedback that starts to pop up.
So the feedback that I encountered was actually in different communities that I'm a part of, in different chats that I'm a part of, where people were looking at the ad and, commenting on it. And of course, when Muslims started to appear in ads, that was a big deal for many Muslims, because if you go back like to 2012, for instance, when Barack Obama was running for president, there was a moment where he had a press conference and he had two women in hijab who were behind him, and then his staff moved the two women from behind him because of the optics of having two hijabis at a time when the media was saying, oh, his name's Barack Hussein Obama. He's actually Muslim. We need to see his birth certificate. Is he actually American? And then people were saying, no, he's not Muslim. He's Christian. And then Colin Powell even was interviewed at that point, and he came in and he said, so what if he was Muslim? What's the big deal? Like, why is that a problem? And so this was 2012. So just 4 years later, now it's there, and I remember going to a Bernie rally and they were looking for people with hijab to put behind him. So it was like a complete 180. And now you have all these companies with ads that are intentionally putting people that look very stereotypically Muslim in their ads and doing it proudly. So people were noticing, like, oh my goodness, does this mean Islamophobia is decreasing? Does this mean Muslims are more mainstream? Like, what does this symbolize? And then someone happened to know this Imam personally and knew that he actually worked as a postal worker. And that's what led to the title of this article.
The title, I absolutely love the title. So you have an interest in, originally you were working in, you're studying for advertising, right? When you were, so that's part of your path. Do you still pay attention to this in your own work? Is this something that kind of bleeds through in all of your work?
A little bit. As professors and as academics, you're always asked, oh, what project are you working on? And then you're asked, what's your next project? It's a common question. And, for a while now, I've been saying, well, my next project is going to be on marketing and Muslims. And for the past couple of years, I think more now, actually, probably 3 or 4 years, every time I see it or encounter an ad that has a Muslim presented or some item or something that presents as Muslimish, I'll screenshot it and kind of document where and when I saw it. And so I have a huge folder of that. What I'm going to do with that is still to be determined. But yes, it is something I'm interested in. So definitely when I saw this ad, I was intrigued and I started Googling about it. And in fact, even found an article where an old professor from my advertising classes when I was at Boston University was quoted commenting on this ad, saying it's the first time an ad ever portrayed an imam. And I don't know if he's right or wrong. I found it really fascinating how my life came full circle. Or this old advertising professor happened to be commenting on an ad that I was writing about with an authority saying that it's the first time an imam is in an ad according to his knowledge.
So you wrote that article in 2018, and there's a lot of details about the professionalization of imams in general in that article. And so here we are 6 years later. It's another presidential election year. I'm wondering what has changed since you wrote the article. Is it trending towards more professionalism within being an imam? Like what are some developments, if there are any, that have changed in the last 6 years since you wrote this piece?
There are some changes. One of the bigger changes that I've noticed is that there's a new generation of people working as imams in the United States who are younger. When I first did research, and my research took me mostly to cities that had seminaries. And when I was in those cities, I would reach out through a snowball or like people that know people and try to schedule interviews with people who identified as imams. And I did as many of them as I could in the city while I was there, and met over the years several hundred imams and interviewed close to 100 imams. I met all of these imams. This is around 2014, 2015, 2016. And at the time, and the data from, there's very few studies that have tried to survey, showed that most imams were immigrants. They trained abroad, they're born and raised abroad, trained abroad, and then they would come here to work. That was the majority of them. And I think from the interviews that I had, that reflected also the majority of people that I interviewed with. But then fast forward to the pandemic in 2020, and I did an online survey and offered in the survey was trying to understand how the pandemic was impacting imams. And in the survey, I offered, if you're willing to have a Zoom interview with me, please include your email address. And so I conducted several interviews on Zoom after that. And there is a bias because it's Zoom and it's 2020. And so perhaps it's younger people that are more inclined to respond to that and say yes. But in all cases, there was a lot of younger people that emerged who I hadn't met before, who are now working as imams. And I see it when I travel in communities and visit different mosques. There's definitely a lot more people who were born and raised here, and then either studied here under some teachers or at one of these seminaries, or traveled abroad and studied, or some mix of the two, and are working now and identified by community members as imams. So that's one big change that took place. I think the other is that the imams themselves are starting to organize better around their profession and field, and try to create some way to support one another to mitigate against some of the challenges that they face. So they'll help each other review job offers. They'll help each other put together resumes. Like they kind of give each other advice to help set each other up in a way that can make their job more healthy. So I see more of that than I did 10 years ago when I started this work.
Well, okay, so you and I came together because you're also doing some trainings on public scholarship with sacred rights. And I'm curious about your thoughts on the importance of public scholarship in general and your like why you are doing these sorts of trainings. What are you enjoying about this?
Yeah, this is something I think about a lot in my work as an anthropologist. Anthropology is largely what they call like a decolonial discipline, right? It's a
Hmm.
discipline that recognizes that there's a history and legacy of colonialism that took place in the world and that left an imprint. And what does it mean to undo the inequities and the oppression that emerged because of that imprint? And there are some disciplines where that's very centered when you are in a college or a university, and there are others where that might be recognized but not as centered, and there are others where that's just really not an active part of what they do at all. And that can be good and bad for different reasons, but largely anthro is very decolonial. And when I think about what it means to be decolonial, I think about the university itself and what does it mean for a university to decolonize, and what does it mean for knowledge to be decolonized. And so this kind of bifurcation between public and academic is one I don't want to accept. Like I don't want
Mm,
to think of them as two different sites. I think that in order for us to really be doing decolonial work, it can't be that you see the academy as separate from the public, but those two are always together in relationship with one another, and working together and learning from one another if we are to be decolonial in the way that we do that. Otherwise, if it's academics who leave this kind of ivory tower to go study people outside the academy and bring their purported knowledge and expertise to it, and then bring that back to the academy to serve the academy and expand the academy's way of understanding the world, and get promotion for their own work but not work with the community, then how are we really doing decolonial work? And so a lot of the work that I do tends to fall under what's called public scholarship, because I'm so persistent on trying to find some harmony between these spaces and merge them to some extent, if that makes sense.
yeah. How do you think about the risks and the rewards of doing this kind of work that might be seen by large amounts of people in the world?
There's a lot of risks, and I hope a lot of reward. I mean, the risk is it's not traditional. Like that's not traditionally how scholarship has been structured, and it's not traditionally how scholars have been assessed. So when and if I go up for my tenure promotion, will I be legible to those who are evaluating me? I don't know. These are some risks that I take. There's risks in terms of how do you do this kind of work in a way that honors and is equitable to everybody involved, because it's also not the norm. So what does it mean to work with others? Like I might have this understanding and this vision, but that might not be what others understanding and vision is, right? Like people might have expectations from me as a scholar, even though I'm trying to disrupt them. They might think that I know everything and I'm the expert, and I'm trying to say, no, we all have knowledge and we can all co-produce this together, right? And so there's a lot that you're trying to do there. That's definitely some risk. And some rewards are that you can start to hopefully disrupt some of these inequities that exist in these spaces.
What are some of the skills that you feel like you're developing the most within the trainings recently?
I'm constantly learning. That's part of what I love the most about the space and the work that I'm privileged to be in. In terms of sacred rights, that program in particular, the one that I attended, it does a very excellent job at teaching you about media in particular, especially like print media, but also, podcasts and
Hmm.
television and whatnot. But they connect you with experts in that space. They teach you how to speak their language, how to share your work with them so that it can appeal to them, so that you understand what they're looking for, so that they understand what you're doing. They create a network between the people they're training, and that's a cohort that can support each other as well. And then between different editors and different, media experts and professionals. And so that's like such a huge privilege to have access to that. And on top of that, you get the mentorship of the sacred rights leaders who are so impressively accomplished in this space, and they can guide you through that and connect you as well and give you feedback. So that's definitely been such a privilege, and like I've learned so much through them.
This is fantastic. Well, Dr. Nancy Khalil, I have really enjoyed talking to you about your work. I loved learning about the professionalization of imams in the United States because, like I said, this is kind of a gap that I've had on the show that I've never thought about. So I'm super lucky as well that I get to do this kind of stuff. Like just like you mentioned, you're lucky being able to continue to grow. I am lucky as well. So, do you have anything that you'd like to shout out or suggest people check out if they want to know more about what it is that you've got going on?
My stuff kind of surfaces on Google Scholar randomly. Facebook, you could follow me there. LinkedIn is another site. My public footprint is still evolving, so that the more of that will emerge. And I have a book that's coming out, but not soon, within probably a couple of years, with Stanford University Press. That's currently called Limited Imams, and it's on this topic in much more depth if it's one you're interested in. So I recommend staying tuned for that.
Wonderful. Well, when the book comes back out, I would love to have you come back on the podcast and talk about that too. So you are cordially invited back, and I hope to our paths cross again. Dr. Nancy Khalil, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Greg, for this work and all of the wonderful knowledge you provide us.